The moment I stepped off the rickety cart onto the soft mud outside Hinterkaifeck farm, I felt it, a chill that no breeze could explain. It was March of 1922, and Germany's economy trembled under hyperinflation. Every coin I carried might be worthless by sundown. I was a reporter from Munich, drawn by whispers of a massacre so strange, the local constabulary could furnish no plausible motive. I tell you plainly, I do not believe in ghosts or ancient curses, yet what I found there threatened my disbelief more than any fairy tale ever could. Official records spoke of 6 bodies discovered in that lonely farmhouse. Andreas Gruber, his wife Cecilia, their widowed daughter Victoria Gabriel, her 2 children, Cecilia and Joseph, and the maid, Maria Baumgartner. They perished at the hands of a blunt instrument, an ivory-handled spade, the farmhouse's own tool. The bloodstains on the scuffed floorboards spoke in Morse code, a message I couldn't yet decipher. Still, I held fast to skepticism. Reports of livestock herded into the barn for days afterward, of footprints leading from the forest and back again, suggested a human killer, not some phantom. My first night there, I laid out my sparse provisions by the stove, the only warmth in the drafty kitchen that wore a quilt of dust and sorrow. Outside, the forest's skeletal boughs scratched against the windows like fingernails. I dared not peer into the gloom. Instead, I lit a lantern and studied the splintered hinges of the door where someone had entered. The Grubers were isolated, 7 kilometers from the nearest town, Kaifeck, so remote that rumor bloomed unchecked. Some said Victoria's 2-year-old son had cried out to Father in Black in the nights before his death. Others spoke of a stranger's footprints disappearing under fresh snow without a return trail. I found none of that credible. I sought facts. At dawn, I combed through official depositions. Officers recorded finding tracks of 6 pairs of boots, leading away from the house into the woods. 6, matching the victims, yet no sign of footprints returning. They posited the killer might have stood atop a fence rail, stepping lightly back, but the explanation felt contrived. On the mantel, I noticed a date scratched into the oak. 12th of March, 2022. That was the very day the murders took place. Somebody had wanted the date remembered, and perhaps feared it would slip from memory in this wasteland of despair. That afternoon, I interviewed Franz, a neighbor who discovered the carnage. His voice trembled as he recounted how the silence of 6 lifeless forms froze his blood. I called for help, he said, but the air, God help me, the air tasted of iron. He insisted the barn doors swung open, though he'd bolted them the night before. I nodded and scribbled notes, asking only neutral questions. I judged him a good man, overwhelmed by horror, not an unreliable witness. Yet on his farm, I later saw his prized calf slaughtered in precisely the same fashion, its skull crushed by an ivory-handled spade. A coincidence? My journalistic instinct screamed otherwise. That evening, I crept under a flimsy cloak up to the barn. I intended only to confirm Franz's tale in cold light. The door yielded without resistance, and inside lay the corpses of the Grubers' cows and pigs, splayed like sacrificial offerings. The faint moonlight glinted on a single boot print in dried manure, then ended abruptly. I froze. The air grew thick, as if I'd plunged underwater. I convinced myself it was my pulse, hammering in my ears. I bent low to study the print, but when I raised my head, I realized I was not alone. A figure stood in the shadows, motionless. I fled before I could register its features. I returned at dawn, heart still pounding beneath my threadbare jacket. There was no print, no disturbance, only straw flattened by my own footprints from the night before. I pressed my ear to the stall door, awaiting a breath or a whisper, but found nothing. I told myself I'd dreamed the figure, that exhaustion and superstition had conjured it. Still, I could not shake the certainty that something alive lurked at the edge of reason. Over the next day, I scoured local archives for any precedent. I uncovered a centuries-old legend of a vengeful spirit of a farmhand wronged by the Gruber ancestors. An almanac entry from 1743 described blood on a spade and a body found among the rye. Locals swore the land was cursed, yet no scholar had ever corroborated the story. I noted the absence of historians' interest in rural massacres. They preferred grander crimes in Berlin or Hamburg. Thus, this atrocity, so utterly brutal, languished in obscurity, its details decaying like autumn leaves. That night, I barricaded the door with a wagon wheel and resolved to stay awake until dawn. I set my watch by the ticking of the hall clock, whose pendulum swayed with a dull lull. At midnight, the pendulum halted, the clock clicking over to 12 with an agonizing slowness. Behind me, the lantern guttered, casting grotesque shadows on the wall. I heard the jangle of metal. I dared not turn. Then a soft thud, as though something heavy fell in the kitchen. My blood turned to ice. I leapt to the door, pried the wheel aside, and flung the door open. No one stood in the hallway. The footprints in the dirt outside matched no boot size I knew. They were too small to belong to the hired help, too broad for a child. I recognized them only as footsteps, human or otherwise. I fled into the forest, stumbling over roots and frozen mud, guided solely by the pale moon. When I returned at first light, villagers found me curled beneath an oak, babbling about spades and shadows. I was incoherent, my notebook soaked in cold sweat. They brought me back to town, fed me broth, and sent me to Munich on the next train. I clutched my papers and photographs, evidence of 6 bodies, cattle slaughtered, footprints without return. But at the station, a man in a dark overcoat approached and tipped his hat. He handed me an ivory-handled spade, mud still clinging to its blade. "Truth is buried," he said in a voice like gravel. "Dig deeper." Then he vanished into the crowd. I never wrote the full account. Official press dismissed the killings as the work of a deranged maniac, and my evidence was deemed circumstantial. In the years since, I've searched for that stranger, only to find records of a farmhand named Wilhelm Kramer, who died in 1888, 34 years before the legend began. I admit I have no rational explanation for the spade or the boots. I do not believe in ghosts, yet I cannot claim the tale is purely superstition. Tonight, I paste these words into a notebook bound in oilcloth, for they may be the last testament of a man who peered too close into rural darkness. If you find this account, know that the world holds corners so remote that logic twists upon itself. I urge you, do not go to Hinterkaifeck. Do not tread lightly over history's graves. And if ever you hear the scrape of a spade in the night, remember this: some truths, once unearthed, refuse to be buried again.